Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode, I'll be making a tall vase from maple segmented rings and 3D printed templates, all cast in epoxy resin. This is a project I've been thinking about for a number of months. It's an experiment of sorts. Some things I've done before and some things are new. I'm building up to a bigger project later in the year, and this will help me get the proof of concept. So without further ado, let's get into it. It's been a long time since I used maple. It seemed to be everywhere 3 years ago, then it disappeared, until recently when I found a reliable source for quality lengths of it. The bandsaw took care of milling the timber to the required dimension of 25 by 50 millimeters. Then it was over to the table saw. This project required 9 rings, each with 12 segments, so 108 in total. I'll just show a couple of rings being cut. The angle for the wedgie sled arms is 15 degrees. This is the template I used to assemble the rings. This creates a 2mm joint between each segment, which will be filled with epoxy resin. Once I have the 12 segments in the template, I use an elastic band to hold them in place. Then I press a pronged spacer into the joints, and then I use super glue to fix it to the segmented ring. This first set of segmented rings are for the base, 4 rings in total. And with the segmented ring free from the template, I superglued another prong spacer on the other side to lock everything in place. After the first ring, I assemble another in the same way. Ring number 2 complete, I begin the third one, but this only has one spacer superglued to it. Once free from the template, I then press the spacer glued to a completed ring into the open joints. Superglue is then trickled down into the spacer and an accelerator is used to fast cure the glue, locking the 2 rings together. To be honest, I'd got a bit ahead of myself. I had to freehand the next ring because I had another completed ring with spacers on both sides. This was quite easy to do, and I think I'll try it with my next segmented ring project. And that's the base done. It looks a bit higgledy-piggledy, but once the base is turned to shape, it'll look much better. I didn't have a silicone mould or anything that would serve as a mould, so I resorted to covering it in packaging tape, 2 layers, just to make sure it was leak-proof. Placed in a silicone mould to catch any leaks, I got on with the rest of the rings to give me 4 separate sections, which I'm going to skip over. They were all done in more or less the same way. I ended up with a base, a midsection feature ring, a lower neck ring, and a combined upper neck and rim section. Which brings me nicely onto this episode's sponsor, T-Expert, epoxy resin for all manner of arts and crafts applications. You'll find a link to the website and a 10% discount code in the video description. For the segmented ring castings, the chosen colour was black. It contrasts well with the maple, and it's why I 3D printed the spacers black. In case I cut through and exposed them, it wouldn't show up. I had a good dollop of mica powder and thoroughly mixed each batch for a minimum of 2 minutes. 3 batches mixed, I poured the resin straight into the castings. No need to pre-cure, though I would say that if you're going to do this, consider priming the segments with clear epoxy before assembling the rings. I don't do it because I don't have time, as this would add at least 1 extra a day waiting for the epoxy primer to cure. Any that looked like they would float in the resin were weighed down. Then with all 4 castings full, I placed them into the pressure pot where they stayed overnight to cure. It's the same day, and now it's the turn of the 3D printed features to be loaded with epoxy resin. And with no room in the pressure pot, these would be curing on the workbench. The first colour was orange. The first casting is the feature for the vase neck, followed by the 2 intersecting squares for the midsection. The orange resin was then decanted into a smaller silicone cup to make it easier to pour. Then the neck feature was filled. This is the first of 3 colours for this casting. Then the other 2 parts were filled with orange resin in the allotted voids. These would have the same 3 colours and white to fill the bigger sections. Orange done. Next was teal coloured resin. Then it was yellow coloured epoxy resin. And to finish the casting, white coloured epoxy to fill the centre void and the remaining outer voids. These were then left overnight to cure. It's the next day and time to check out the castings. The coloured 3D printed features all look good, no visible voids and no cracking. The midsection maple ring looked good, but the lower neck and base section were not good. The resin had soaked into the segments, leaving the upper joints dry. They will need to be refilled and spend another night in the pressure pot. And once I got it out of the mould, the upper neck rim casting looked fine also. First on the lathe is a maple ring for the midsection. The waste blocks needed to go, then I could begin to reveal the segments underneath. Unfortunately, the gouge dug into one piece of sapele and levered the workpiece off the chuck. And if you're wondering, my head was right next to the camera, and that's exactly what I saw as the ring excused itself and flew past me, hitting the wood storage racks behind me. After exposing one side, I flattened the surface and turned it around and began removing more waste material. With both sides of the maple ring exposed, next was one of the 3D printed features. This had a very thin mould that needed to be removed. The black base would be retained around the edge. Once they'd uncovered the white resin, I was surprised to see some voids in the casting. Not the end of the world, but I guess that's the price for not using the pressure pot. I used a skew to clean up the black printed surface and hollowed out a bit in the middle, and it was ready for the maple ring to be bonded in place. For this I used 5-minute epoxy resin. A few minutes later the epoxy had cured. I turned the blank around so I could cut a simple mortise, then I could use the 4-jaw chuck. I felt this would be safer than the cold jaws. Now I could continue cutting away the waste material and hollow out half of the midsection. When I'd cut through the mould into the white epoxy, it was just a case of removing enough to lighten the workpiece and tidy up the inner surface. Inside done, I sanded to 800 grit and added a wax finish. Then I moved on to the second of the 3D printed features. First I cut a mortise so I could fix it on a 4-jaw chuck. And with the piece turned around, I could remove the mould and hollow out the underside. For this I used a negative rake carbide with a new cutter, which made a huge difference, removing material at an incredible rate. Same as before, once the bulk of the material had been removed, I sanded and added a finish. Then the two pieces that make up the midsection were bonded together using 5-minute epoxy. Whilst doing this, care was taken to line up the joints. After the epoxy had cured, I began shaping the blank. For this I used the bowl gouge on the maple and the negative rake carbide on the resin sections. For now this was just going to be a cursory profiling. The fine-tuning would come later. I used a skew to remove the tool marks, and it was then that I spotted a problem. When I bonded the two pieces together, I'd made sure the joints lined up, but I'd not checked the coloured sections matched each other. Should I leave it or should I correct it? I couldn't make my mind up, So I moved on to the upper neck rim casting. Okay, so there are a lot of separate castings in this project, and if I show them all being prepared, basically stripping away the excess material, exposing the segmented rings, this video will be around an hour long, so in an effort to keep it to a reasonable length, I'll skip ahead in a few of the repetitive sections. So with that in mind, this is the before and the after of the upper neck rim section. Segments exposed. Next I had to drill out the centre. For this I used a 40mm Forstner bit. That done, next was a 3D printed neck feature. Before bonding it to the maple rings, I had to expose the coloured resin so I could line up the joints. A small amount of 5-minute epoxy was mixed, then applied to the underside of the feature ring. This was then bonded to the maple section, making sure to line up the joints. The tailstock was used to exert the required pressure. The nit too was drilled out using the same 40mm Forstner bit. Using the skew, I faced off the end ready for when it would be bonded to the lower section, and then I turned it around and flared out the inside of the upper rim section. I did it now because the chuck would have better purchase whilst the workpiece was this short. For the same reason, I removed a lot of material from the resin maple joint area. In hindsight, I didn't have to do this at this point. But anyway, with that done, I moved on to the lower neck section, and once again, I'll skip forward. This is the lower neck section, before cleanup, and then after. Then the inside was hollowed out, sanded, and a wax finish applied. And with the midsection refixed to the lathe, I bonded the lower neck section in place, making sure, once again, to line up the joints. This is where I decided to fix the alignment problem. Using a thin parting tool, I cut into the joint, followed by a Japanese handsaw to separate the two pieces. Then I cleaned up each side of the joint. Surface is clean, I rebonded the two pieces back together using a 3D printed spacer to act as a joint. And there you have it, problem fixed. The lower neck needed some work to blend it into the midsection. This was done with a negative rate carbide and the skew. It still needed a bit more work, but that could wait. I wanted to bond the upper neck in place using another 3D printed spacer to act as a joint. Now, try as I might, I couldn't get all the joints to line up. I could get 2/3 to match, but the rest were off, so that would have to do. In the heat of the day, the 5-minute epoxy cured very quickly, so a few minutes later I set to with a negative rate carbide and the large negative rate scraper, blending the sections together. A quick trim of the rim, and then I set about shaping the inner part. This was a bit scary. I'd come so far, and now I had to do this bit unsupported. To say I did it carefully is a massive understatement. But I needn't have worried, it all went very well. I sanded to a fine finish and pushed the tailstock back into place. Now I could finish blending and fairing the neck into the midsection. I used a skew on the convex curves and the large negative rate scraper on the concave curves to create a flowing profile from the rim down towards the base. After sanding with 80 grit to remove any tool marks, I could then get started on the last section, the base. This section didn't require a lot of work, but I'll skip ahead to where the outer waste has been cut away, each end has been cleaned up and faced, and a mortise cut to fix it to a 4-jaw chuck. All done, now I could bond this to the main section. This was done with more 5-minute epoxy and another 3D spacer to act as a joint. Epoxy cured, I set about shaping the base. Now at this point, other than it having a wide foot so it wouldn't be easily knocked over, I had no idea how it should look. The things going through my head were maybe a cutout, maybe I should try rolling a couple of beads in it, or should I drill out the centre and install an epoxy filled 3D printed part, which I could then expose. I couldn't make my mind up, so I decided to start removing material and try and find a shape. The first idea I explored was a cutout in the lower part of the base, and almost straight away I could see it wouldn't work. So before going any deeper, I switched to the negative rate carbide. With this, I tidied up the edge of the foot and removed the section above, and there was the rough shape. No cutouts, no beads, just a simple flowing curve down into a wide foot. Simple is sometimes the best answer. Whilst I was refining the profile, it was obvious the foot was too thick. The edge needed to be trimmed down, but I wanted to keep the joint on the transition between the base and the foot, so I thought that adding a step would be the way forward. And this worked surprisingly well. It also gave me the opportunity to thin the base down at the transition point, making the step more pronounced. So with the shape more or less finalised, there was just a bit of blending and refining, and that was it. Should I have added a bead just above the foot? I'm not sure. Maybe that's something for another project, but for now, this one was done. I sanded from 80 to 600 grit, then up to 3000 grit, just on the resin parts, then I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. This was followed with 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit. A single application, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing. First, Mirka Polar Shine 10. A single coat, cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polar Shine 5. Another single coat, polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. That's it, another project finished, and I think this is the tallest one I've done. And to be honest, I wasn't sure what to make of it, but over the past couple of days I've grown to like it, and I hope you like it too. I've already moved it twice so I can get a better view of it whilst I'm doing my day job. The colours work well together with the lighter background helping them stand out, and the shape worked out in the end as well. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. A thumbs up will be greatly appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.